Long before many of the most sensational true crime stories gripped the nation, an unassuming teenager from the southern stretches of North Carolina took his first fateful steps into what would become an extraordinary life of high-stakes trafficking and underworld secrets. In a violent era that saw social unrest, the exponential growth of illegal narcotics, and the flourishing of infamous syndicates, his legacy would eventually dwarf several seasoned crime families. While other names in real-life mafia stories have garnered fame in books and on movie screens, his legend often lurks in the shadows, known primarily among specialized circles that study dark history and multinational drug empires. Some say he was the most influential drug dealer of his era, someone who might have become an even larger figure if not for law enforcement's tightening grip and a swirl of covert rivalries. Even so, the man's ambitions rocketed him to unprecedented levels of power, and when he felt time running out, he vanished like a phantom, never to be definitively seen again. His roots were unlikely for an individual bound for the upper layers of organized crime. Growing up among a close-knit black community, he witnessed both hardship and enormous potential. There was a tradition of successful entrepreneurs. Local bankers, funeral home directors, and educators demonstrated that people of color could thrive, even under a segregated system. Yet the daily wage was often meager, and the promise of legitimate prosperity remained frustratingly out of reach for many youths on the margins. Whether it was the allure of fast money, family expectations, or the immediate thrill of a hustle, something drew him away from the usual path toward respectability in favor of an underground life that would supply immense sums of cash and equally immense risk. During his teenage years, he was rumored to have been tangled in petty infractions, like swiping chickens from a farm and lighting up backroom dice tables with a little gambling savvy. To outsiders, he was just another restless soul roving the dusty roads of his hometown. However, people who knew him well noticed something extraordinary simmering beneath the surface: a sharp intelligence, magnetic confidence, and an early talent for negotiation. It would not be long before he outgrew the small-town environment, eventually relocating to Philadelphia for a short stint, then to the crowded streets of Brooklyn. By the mid-1960s, he was steadily taking in the mechanics of local rackets, ranging from running illicit lottery books to forging connections with established dealers. The city's underbelly was a labyrinth. At every street corner, you might find turf wars erupting between small syndicates, while higher up, entire crime families vied for supremacy. A swirl of contraband, from heroin to gambling money, coursed through the neighborhoods. Through ingenious maneuvering, the ambitious newcomer seized every chance that presented itself. Initially, many of the underworld figures saw him as inconsequential, a brash kid perhaps, but hardly a threat to their deeply entrenched hierarchies. They had no inkling that he would ultimately stand toe-to-toe with the era's most notorious kingpins. The historical backdrop favored his meteoric rise. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw an explosive surge in heroin consumption. Entire blocks in major urban centers like Harlem, Philadelphia, and Baltimore found themselves ensnared by the grip of addiction. Political pressure ballooned in response. Politicians demanded a crackdown, media outlets sounded alarms, and local residents lived in fear of robberies, turf disputes, and escalating violence tied directly to drug activity. The White House declared war on narcotics, characterizing heroin as public enemy number one. These dramatic pronouncements only intensified federal interest in smashing illicit distribution networks. Yet, ironically, the frantic environment also created massive opportunities for anyone brazen enough to attempt large-scale distribution. Narcotics, particularly heroin, had long traveled stateside through a notorious pipeline tied to the so-called French Connection. This referred to a smuggling route that began in countries where poppies were cultivated, funneled the product through European labs, and eventually delivered the refined narcotics to distributors in North America. At that time, certain mafia groups allegedly controlled this corridor. But as new players sought direct supply lines, bypassing the longtime gatekeepers, the stage was set for seismic shifts in who occupied America's top rung of the drug business. Entrepreneurs from across the demographic spectrum, including African American and Hispanic operators, realized they no longer needed the official Mafia's approval to acquire substantial quantities of heroin. Now, if they could forge relationships with Corsican or other international suppliers, they could blaze their own paths. And that was precisely what this cunning young man did once he found the right connections. According to crime analysts and scattered informant testimony, he landed a vital link through a Cuban contact who was preparing to relocate to Venezuela. That contact, in turn, introduced him to high-level French suppliers. Before long, shipments of heroin, sometimes in staggering volumes, flowed. These moves propelled him from a mere hustler in the city's backrooms to a legitimate threat who commanded respect everywhere he set foot. The scale of his enterprise became monumental. In phone calls monitored by law enforcement, the sums he casually bandied about, millions of dollars in petty cash alone, indicated that he might be organizing deals that could transform entire city blocks overnight. From Brooklyn to Philly, Baltimore to Cincinnati, Atlanta to Miami, he established a sprawling distribution network that spanned dozens of states. He wasn't just a local peddler. Instead, he was the central source, delivering product in 100-kilo increments and forging under-the-table alliances with the day's biggest regional dealers. Some investigators describe him as the undefeated champion of East Coast heroin at that time, overshadowing other high-profile traffickers better known in pop culture. Meanwhile, attention from law enforcement grew more intense. Undercover teams and special agents tapped phones, tailed him through classic stakeout tactics, and tried to unravel the full expanse of his underworld secrets. Yet time and again, he managed to stay several steps ahead. What astonished observers and even seasoned criminals who crossed paths with him was the sheer boldness of his public displays. Whether rolling up to lavish hotels in a brand new Rolls or betting fistfuls of cash at casinos in Las Vegas, he personified the ultimate daredevil of the narcotics underworld. At the same time, his social circle featured some of the wealthiest, most influential underworld figures from multiple backgrounds. Rumors swirling around these high-profile meetups included talk that he once slammed $4 million in cash on a table, challenging associates to match it if they wanted to run with him. Very few could meet that threshold. Though boisterous in his flamboyant spending, he was quiet about the personal details that truly mattered. Detractors believed that only a fearless genius or a reckless fool would act so openly while engaged in such dangerous pursuits. But he was no fool. He cultivated relationships carefully, rewarded loyalty, and used intimidation when necessary. There were whispered accounts of entire rooms set aside for processing narcotics, rumored to have had workers spending round-the-clock shifts cutting and bagging heroin in mind-boggling quantities. The authorities raided at least one property, nicknamed the Ponderosa, and discovered heaps of plasticine packets, drug residue literally forming layers on tables and floors, and every indication that large sums of money were changing hands at lightning speed. Police reports mentioned that at least one unfortunate man apparently overdosed inside such a facility, presumably from continuous exposure to airborne heroin dust. Some alleged that local police arrived and found the lifeless cutter, whereupon the boss himself reportedly stepped outside, assured law enforcement he would take care of it, and told them they could go. The synergy between corruption and fear often created conditions where many details remain murky. Regardless, these accounts amplified his legend. As profits soared, he moved his loved ones away from Brooklyn's crowded environment, opting for a quiet estate in a part of Staten Island known for affluence and exclusivity. One can only imagine the eyebrows raised when this confident newcomer built a grand residence in a neighborhood with known Mafia patriarchs living right next door. Stately gates, circular driveways, custom-painted sinks, and an array of exotic cars stationed on the grounds were a spectacle. Everyone in that upper-crust enclave was aware that an outsider, someone different, had arrived, and rumors circulated that high-ranking traditional mobsters disliked having him around. Allegedly, they felt threatened, especially by his independence in the heroin trade, and possibly by the flamboyant parties rumored to last all night. Yet none of that stopped him. He had no qualms about standing his ground, believing he possessed more influence, more finances, and more nerve than anyone. Law enforcement scrutiny inevitably intensified with each passing month. Federal investigations roped in numerous agencies, from the Department of Justice to specialized narcotics units. Though he evidently bribed some officials, threatened others, and outfoxed the rest, the proverbial net was closing, slowly but surely. A routine piece of intelligence or a single officer's curiosity, like that of one detective who noticed odd gatherings of out-of-state vehicles in a Brooklyn apartment parking lot, helped connect the dots. Over an 18-month period, cops realized that out of these gatherings arose major heroin trafficking partnerships with dealers traveling from all over the East Coast to see him. Soon, wiretaps started capturing jaw-dropping transactions being scheduled on phone lines. The scale was beyond anything typical investigative teams had encountered from a single individual outside well-established mafia circles. He was organizing massive shipments in ways that overshadowed lesser-known criminals and expanded the boundaries of what it meant to be a drug kingpin at that time. Eventually, a federal indictment came crashing down. Authorities scooped him up in Las Vegas, of all places, a city he frequented for both business and pleasure. Reports say he was arrested while enjoying the neon nightlife and the big fights. The local papers in Vegas covered the story, describing him as a major New York figure, and he was brought before a judge. The bail demand soared to an astronomical level, $5 million, which was the highest set in the country at that time. While lesser criminals would fold under such a punishing amount, he emerged with an almost cavalier attitude. The required cash was raised, rumor has it in astonishingly rapid fashion, and he was released pending trial. It was an event that left the authorities nervously grappling with what kind of resources and connections they were really up against. For several months, while on bail, he stayed visible. He dutifully attended court appointments, giving the impression that he was prepared to wage a legal battle like many indicted dealers do. A more realistic reading, however, suggested he was closely watching each new piece of evidence and every rumor from inside the system. Word soon reached him that prosecutors planned to unveil a more serious superseding indictment that might carry a life sentence. They were apparently ready to escalate, painting him as the biggest fish in the ocean. That, reportedly, was the turning point. Rather than await the blow, he simply vanished overnight, never again to be reliably cited. Detectives and federal marshals launched a sweeping manhunt. Some leads pointed to him retrieving stashes from bank-safe deposit boxes in North Carolina, hustling out the back door moments before an officer arrived. Others insisted he boarded a plane with a girlfriend, presumably heading to the Southern Hemisphere, or perhaps to the Caribbean. Some said he lingered in the United States, relying on cunning disguises, and only moved in circles he trusted absolutely. Others believed he turned to African or European locales. One speculation had him living under new aliases, perhaps with altered appearances courtesy of plastic surgery. The smokescreen was so thick that not even the wiliest investigators could penetrate it. Meanwhile, his immediate circle faced many trials. Literally. They received stiff sentences, some approaching 3 decades, for their involvement in distributing heroin under his purview. When pressed, they provided no credible hints about his whereabouts. Perhaps some of them simply did not know. Others might have believed their loyalty would one day be rewarded, while a few likely feared retribution more than they feared legal repercussions. The core questions soared across the rumor mill. Could a man so richly resourced have arranged an escape so airtight that no trace would ever emerge? Law enforcement across multiple agencies refused to let it go. Posters offering rewards for information circulated widely, from the East Coast to other countries. Tips trickled in sporadically. Someone believed they caught a glimpse of him in the Bahamas. Others swore they saw him in East Africa. Still more claimed to have encountered him in a Texan diner. Each lead was checked, but none panned out. Occasional stories popped up about how he might have died at the hands of rival mobsters who considered him a threat to the delicate balance of the underworld. But no definitive body turned up, and no compelling narrative confirmed his demise. All the while, the original investigators began retiring. Decades slid by, yet no final resolution surfaced. The rumor that he had stashed millions in 1970s dollars offshore suggests that if he truly absconded, he could have financed an entirely new identity. Others pointed out that he had children, a longtime partner, and extended family back home. It was peculiar that they received no covert messages or hush money deposits. The absence of contact or financial support, however, might hint that he had either cut all ties to protect them from the law or else had perished before he could set up any arrangement. Over time, his name receded from popular discourse, overshadowed by the rise of other sensational criminals, new crises in narcotics markets, and shifting priorities in law enforcement. Yet, for those immersed in the annals of unsolved mysteries and the labyrinth of organized crime, his legend never entirely faded. He stands as one of the few major American fugitives who seemingly disappeared without so much as a ripple, leaving behind an empire shattered by prosecutors, federal agents, and the ravages of time. Dissecting his saga illuminates multiple dimensions: the flourishing illicit industries that thrived on systemic inequities, the capacity for corruption and complicity at various institutional levels, the complexities of cross-cultural alliances in the trade, and the utopian illusions of a man who believed he could outrun both rivals and authorities indefinitely. Curiously, the case still remains officially open. On paper, a warrant for his arrest stands. There have been fleeting episodes in more recent times, an instance where investigators pinned hopes on a tip that he was hiding out with relatives, or a story about him being ill and possibly needing a heart procedure in Houston. Each lead fizzled into a dead end. In the world of real-life mafia stories, fugitives are sometimes found after decades of living right under everyone's noses, or they might never be found at all, with myths swirling about them living in some remote region, maybe on a modest farm or a luxurious coastal retreat, safe from recognition. He exemplifies a distinct breed of criminal, a person who, though operating outside conventional morality, commanded surprising loyalty, compelled admiration for his business acumen among certain rings, and brought terror to those who dared challenge him. He was the visionary who convened secret gatherings in major American cities, challenging fellow African-American and Latino traffickers to tower above the older criminal institutions that had historically siphoned profits at the top of the food chain. By cutting out more established crime families, he aimed to keep profits and authority within his own network, effectively rewriting how the drug game could operate. No doubt that mission rankled the older echelons of the underworld, many of whom were unaccustomed to relinquishing their hold on the iron pipeline of dope. As the war on drugs escalated, authorities turned every stone, raiding stash houses, confiscating property, freezing funds, and dismantling street-level operations. Many of his partners found themselves cornered and indicted. Even so, the star defendant consistently managed to slip away, first in plain sight with his brazen swagger, then in total invisibility after he jumped bail. The magnitude of the fiasco left many officials deeply frustrated. If an individual of that caliber could simply vanish, what did it say about the system's capacity to rein in truly audacious criminals? One reason he may have succeeded in maintaining an aura of safety, ironically, was the relatively modest sentencing guidelines in that era compared to what was introduced later. While some cohorts faced double-digit prison terms, it was still feasible to endure that length of incarceration. Hence, fewer incentives existed to betray him for a chance at a drastically reduced sentence. By the time stiffer penalties and mandatory minimums became widespread, most principal participants in his broad network had either served their sentences, passed away, or begun new lives. Vindication and loyalty, along with fleeting illusions that he might re-emerge with hush money, kept them silent. So where does that leave the story now? 4 or 5 decades down the road, the tapestry of underworld secrets bound up with his fate captivates investigators, journalists, and fans of dark history or unsolved mysteries to this day. Some believe he must be dead, given that no one can outrun time indefinitely. Others hypothesize that he adapted seamlessly, forging a benign existence in a hidden corner of the globe, blending into routine gatherings for decades without revealing his old life. The question sparkles in every mention of him. How did he clinch such a perfect flight from justice, and what had truly happened once he slipped away? Speculation runs wild. Could he have been quietly assassinated by offended crime families who seethed at his challenge to their dominion? Or might he have orchestrated deals with international cartels, cementing his place as an enduring presence in the broader narcotics world, perhaps adopting new faces and new names through unscrupulous channels. There's been talk of Jamaican posses, Colombian organizations, and even African smuggling networks. No scenario can be completely discounted in the absence of hard evidence. It's precisely this vacuum of proof that elevated him to a near-mythic status, comparable to the boogeyman or the cunning trickster who defies handcuffs and bullet wounds with equal ease. Yet for all the grand conspiracies, perhaps the simplest solution is that he liquidated enough assets for a final payout, then retreated into anonymity. If so, he would have had to forego his old flamboyant lifestyle, swapping big parties and conspicuous consumption for something far smaller, quieter, and free from the suspicious glare of watchful neighbors. One wonders if his personality, so reliant on prestige and conspicuous success, could handle that radical transformation. Nevertheless, certain criminals have been known to calibrate their approach when forced to hide, if the alternative is a life behind bars or meeting a brutal end. Survival instincts can override a taste for fast cars and diamond jewelry. Of course, he was no lone wolf in the dynamic underworld. Many of his subordinates and partners carried on after his disappearance, though lacking the ironclad leadership he had provided. Some of them became minor legends in their own right, household names in their neighborhoods, celebrities among local barbershops and hangout spots. But none matched the unstoppable climb or the seamless ability to fuse multiple criminal elements under one helmsman. Within the broader scope of true crime, his operation stands as an unsettling demonstration of what can happen when a bright criminal mind, unshackled by older codes, is set loose in a climate hungry for illegal narcotics. He also illustrated a key paradox in the war on drugs. Dismantling a single figure, however influential, never truly resolves the systemic issues fueling addiction and black market demand. Even after he vanished, heroin trafficking and violent crime went on, though in new forms, from new intermediaries. Government crackdowns continued, shifting from heroin to cocaine, from cocaine to opioids, from opioids to synthetic drugs. It's a reminder that dismantling one kingpin is just a fleeting victory unless the entire structure of supply and demand is also addressed. Despite the ephemeral nature of the underworld, the memory of his meteoric rise still resonates among those who lived through that era or studied it after the fact. From the vantage point of younger generations, he is a near-mythical figure, rarely mentioned in mainstream documentaries, but revered among connoisseurs of vintage gangster tales. People still track his rumored sightings, rehash old interviews with retired agents, and scour partly declassified files for any faint references that might solve this most perplexing of unsolved mysteries. There are screenwriters who dream of adapting his underworld secrets into a saga for television or film, but so far, no major production has captured it in quite the same way as certain other well-known criminals of that period. In the absence of closure, every new claim or anecdote serves as fresh kindling. Some folks are certain he's still out there, likely an old man by now, if he's alive at all, drifting through some foreign haven where no one suspects a single chapter of his hidden identity. Others say he must have fallen victim to betrayal or lethal confrontation, and that someone with the right underworld connections orchestrated his permanent disappearance. The truth remains elusive, and each retelling revitalizes the sense of drama surrounding his extraordinary saga. Returning to that single word, vanished, still sends chills through those who chased his trail. In a world bristling with advanced surveillance, border checks, informants, and technology that can track even the faintest digital footprint, how can one slip away so utterly? Part of the answer lies in timing. He fled during a period when tracking tools were still comparatively rudimentary and when cross-agency computer databases were in their infancy. Another factor was his resourcefulness with bribes, safe houses, and forged documentation. Combine that with a charismatic presence and a knack for making people comfortable around him, and it's little wonder that he managed to cultivate unwavering loyalty. At least, no official account has proven otherwise. So here stands the final riddle. Perhaps there is no final answer. Instead, we have an extraordinary man who, despite overshadowing so many peers and terrorizing entire regions with the wave of addiction, remains an open question to this day. The perplexity endures. How did a single figure accumulate that much wealth, that much contraband, that much power, and then evaporate into thin air? He ranks among the pantheon of overshadowed criminals who, despite their lesser mainstream recognition compared to more cinematic names, orchestrated operations impressive enough to stand on par with the biggest players. From the vantage point of specialized historians, his story epitomizes how one daring individual exploited every nuance of political and social upheaval, channeling it into a fortress of underworld might. He left behind a swirl of controversies regarding law enforcement corruption, the infiltration of legal and financial institutions, and the bridging of race and language barriers in a time when inter-ethnic alliances among criminals were not typical. He also tore open the old assumption that the real mafia was strictly Italian, demonstrating that African American, Hispanic, and other groups had the wit and capability to build massive empires of their own. Decades have passed with no arrest, no grave, and no incontrovertible sign of his fate. The Watchers, the U.S. Marshals, and the DEA still keep the file alive, an eternal symbol of their ongoing quest to dispel the notion that anyone can fully cheat the system. And yet, each year that goes by without new leads deepens the enigma's hold on public imagination. You might wonder if it matters whether he's alive or not. In many ways, his legend lasts, shaping how we frame true crime narratives and champion or condemn figures who break the mold in organized crime. To some, he was a cunning predator who built his fortune on the suffering of addicts. To others, he offered a rebellious tilt against the entrenched mafia, taking advantage of new social currents to become a pioneer for minority-dominated crime networks. To still others, he's an example of the elusive anti-hero who outwitted the authorities and vanished as a form of poetic justice. None of these perspectives are entirely accurate or wholly flawed. The man, like so many at the apex of notorious kingpins, was far too multidimensional to be pinned down by moral labels alone. Reflecting upon his story involves grappling with the broader complexities of the American experience during that pivotal juncture in history: the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, economic shifts, and the explosion of narcotics ravaging urban communities. He served as both a product of his time and an architect shaping the underworld of that era. If, by some extraordinary chance, an aging figure emerges tomorrow and is confirmed to be him, the collective reaction would be an earthquake in the realm of real-life mafia stories. Perhaps an aged man in his twilight years would stand in a courtroom facing charges that date back generations. Whether a conviction would follow or whether the evidence has grown too stale is a puzzle. The families of overdose victims might clamor for justice. Others might question if it's even relevant after so many decades. And if he is never found, the story remains in that swirling netherworld, a testament to how reality can outstrip fiction, especially when the shadows of power, cunning, and money converge. Documentaries may continue to re-examine his files, authors might re-spin his tale for new generations enthralled by gangster sagas, and law enforcement agencies may meticulously reopen aspects of the case from time to time in search of that final break. Yet every retelling circles back to the same mesmerizing question: how does one of the most wanted drug lords in American history manage to slip away, with an entire nation's agencies bearing down on him, and leave not the slightest trace? In many ways, this is the crown jewel of unsolved mysteries from that tumultuous period. The magnitude of the feat boggles the mind, especially given that fugitives today are routinely located after a few short years, some within months, thanks to technology, data analytics, and collaborative policing. This man's success, if success is the right word, redefines what it means to have operational intelligence in a clandestine enterprise. Though an alleged criminal, he commanded an empire that spanned coasts, used cunning interpersonal strategies, deployed intimidation with surgical precision, and distributed a product flooding into countless neighborhoods. He lived amid swirling rumors of constant extortion attempts, attempted hits, and unimaginable fortunes skimmed from endless streams of street-level sales. Ultimately, his domain crashed like so many other empires, but the emperor? Gone. In this sense, his story is an epic that speaks both to the unsparing reality of cause and effect in crime, and to the possibility of an individual manipulating fate to orchestrate a personal getaway. If modern audiences glean one moral from a saga so drenched in moral ambiguity, perhaps it's that illusions of omnipotence, whether held by criminals or the authorities, are never unshakable. A cunning mind can break out from what seems like the tightest net, just as a lawman's devotion can topple the mightiest regime. Among the labyrinthine chapters of organized crime's dark history, his disappearance stands as a testament to intangible cunning. To this day, he is invoked by people who find themselves in a difficult spot with the law, muttering, "I'll do what he did, slip away with a fortune and never come back." But few, if any, have ever repeated the trick with similar results. His story invites us to wrestle with the broader question: can a person truly erase themselves to the point that not even an echo remains? The 20th century was rife with cunning criminals, dogged manhunts, and major standoffs. Almost everyone was eventually brought to heel, yet he outlasted them all, or so the legend insists. And considering the unstoppable passage of time, we might never find out the truth. Thus, you have a sweeping portrait of someone who soared to the zenith of the narcotics trade, hobnobbed with flamboyant underworld personalities, brashly thumbed his nose at the Mafia, enthralled local communities in places like Brooklyn and Philadelphia, reaped untold millions, and then vanished as though conjured away by some arcane spell. For those who suspect an eventual resolution, well, no evidence so far suggests it's imminent. Meanwhile, the puzzle grows progressively more distant, wrapped in layers of rumor, hush-hush confessions, and the unstoppable tide of time. He remains one of the greatest enigmas in the annals of true crime, a figure whose name might not be recognized by every average citizen, but who unquestionably left an imprint that dwarfs many better publicized mobsters. Even now, his story resonates, capturing imaginations with elements worthy of the grandest Hollywood tale. Ambition, betrayal, unbridled wealth, near misses with law enforcement, and a final act that defies logic. In the realm of unsolved mysteries, this one stands tall, reminding us of the untamed unpredictability that lurks beneath the veneer of law and order. Perhaps that is how he would have wanted it. And indeed, that might be the only ending possible for a man who lived by his own rules, boasted about unstoppable achievements, and refused to accept the inevitability of prison. Whether the truth emerges or not, his story has become immortalized in the dense tapestry of underworld legends. For many, it's a cautionary reminder of how even the best investigative efforts can sometimes fail when confronted by a criminal mind that prepared thoroughly, adapted quickly, and possessed seemingly infinite resources. For others, it's the ultimate example of a rebel beating the system, though the moral price of that victory remains infinitely debatable. Ultimately, the name of this vanished figure continues to loom silently, both a reminder of a harrowing time in America's past and a riddle no one has fully solved. Should fresh evidence appear, a new generation of lawmen might uncover the final puzzle piece that reveals his fate. Until then, we are left to speculate, weaving together truth, conjecture, and myth into a narrative that edges ever closer to legend. If he still lives somewhere in the shadows, perhaps he warily glances over his shoulder each morning, aware that if one slip of information leaves his lips, federal marshals might close in. Or maybe he departed this world decades ago, taking all his secrets to a silent grave. The outcome is as clandestine as the day he slipped off into the darkness. And that is how one audacious gambler from North Carolina rose to become a king among the world of illicit narcotics, and then pulled off one of the most notorious disappearing acts in the annals of organized crime. His story is a tapestry of ambition, cunning, wealth, fear, loyalty, and freedom. The ultimate fate of the man and the millions he purportedly secreted away endures as a testament to the enduring power of underworld secrets. Whether the final reveal ever surfaces or not, his name belongs among the legends that shape real-life mafia stories, reminding us that in a landscape as vast and volatile as the criminal realm, few things are certain, even the final chapter.